Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's USAID Stakeholder Community Meeting on Global Agriculture, Food Security, and Resilience. My name is Jen Cupp, and I am the Communications Director for Feed the Future and the USAID Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. Before we get started, I'd like to provide a few tips to orient you to the webinar platform. Please do continue to introduce yourselves in the chat box. We are delighted to see such a broad range of partners joining us today. The chat box is your main way of communicating with us on this webinar. Please enter your questions, comments, and suggested resources at any time throughout the webinar in that box. We will be collecting your questions and we'll answer some of them during our question and answer session in the latter half of the webinar. Even if we can't respond today, your questions will help us shape upcoming communications and guidance, so please do share them. I'd like to note that today's discussion will be held under Chatham House rules and information is provided on background. Today's event is meant to be the start of a discussion with our external stakeholders and is not a definitive source for reporting. If you have any technical issues with the webinar platform, please hover over Adam Ahmed and Tyler Wellman's names in the host pod to start a private chat with them. You'll see a flashing tab appear at the bottom of the chat box, and you can talk about technical issues with them, and they'll do their best to assist you. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and we intend to share the recording and additional post-event resources with you in the coming weeks, so keep an eye out for those. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'll hand it over to Maura Berry, our Acting Assistant to the Administrator in the new Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. Maura, over to you.
Good afternoon, or morning or evening, depending on where you are. And thank you so much for joining this USAID webinar today. I'm Maura Berry Boyle, and I lead USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. I'm currently acting in this role as our leader, Beth Dunford, is serving on the agency's COVID-19 task force. So for those of you that don't know me, perhaps just to say I've been with the agency for about 20 years, most of that working overseas in East Africa, Southeast Asia, and most recently in the Caribbean. And I joined the Bureau last March. You'll also be hearing from my colleagues, Greg Collins and Trey Hicks, and they'll introduce themselves when we get to their sections of this presentation. So let me get started by saying that, first of all, it's really fantastic to be here today with all of you, albeit, virtually. And I'm really thankful, for this opportunity that we can come together to discuss how this pandemic is impacting, vulnerable communities and countries across our globe. This virus, this COVID-19 really has rocked our world, and I know that we're all adapting to this new reality. So I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that while we're all grappling in our workspace, we're also dealing with the impacts of this on a very personal level. And so my heart goes out to all of you that might be suffering pain or loss at this time. There's still so much that we don't know about the impacts of COVID-19 on agriculture and food security and resilience. And the information that we're getting is changing at such a rapid pace. So while, we've been in touch with a lot of you, and I see so many people have signed in, and we've spoken to a lot of you individually, we thought it was really important to bring our whole stakeholder community together jointly. Of course, we don't have all the answers, and it's really important that we work together as a community to share information on the secondary impacts that are already being felt around the world today. In this unprecedented time, the U.S. government is focused on delivering a comprehensive package of services to support our international partners around the world. This builds on the U.S. government's long-standing investments in global health and food security and humanitarian assistance, which has created the foundation for today's COVID response. Various U.S. government departments and agencies, including USAID, are quickly deploying and delivering essential support to the most in need. The goal is first and foremost to save lives. Secondly, to reduce secondary impacts of the pandemic. And thirdly, to promote U.S. leadership and share U.S. expertise for global benefit. So this second point on addressing secondary economic impacts is particularly important to our topic today, which is food security. To respond to these challenges, we're currently focused on, first of all, adapting our current food security and assistance programming to address these ongoing challenges, and also on protecting the development gains and planning for long-term implications. This is a point that is especially pertinent for us as the newly formed Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, which was made official early last month. This transformation, which is part of the larger agency-wide transformation, enables us to better coordinate across our different technical areas, which includes agricultural-led growth, water security, sanitation and hygiene, nutrition, and resilience. Our structure also enables us to better bridge humanitarian and development responses by partnering with the forthcoming bureaus that will soon be stood up of humanitarian assistance and for conflict prevention and stabilization. You know, it's through this connection that we can better support vulnerable families and communities to transition from crises to development and ultimately to self-reliance. I think that all of you here today would agree that current events are only substantiate the need for solutions that cut and transcend sectors. It is equally critical to bridge the humanitarian and development divide, and that now, more than ever, we need to elevate a resilience as a development priority, which is reflected in our Bureau's transformation. In addition, now more than ever, there needs to be a coordinated and streamlined effort between the U.S. government and all of you who represent, research organizations and academia, nonprofits, NGOs, and the private sector. With all of the critical players that have gathered here today, we'd like to use this afternoon to share with you what we know at this point, and also to have an active discussion with all of you on what you're hearing on your end and what would be helpful for you to hear from us. I'd like also to remind everyone that this is the first of 3 sessions we're conducting, with the other 2 sessions focused on nutrition and water. Please note that the questions that you might have around specific operating procedures for USAID implementing partners, those will be addressed in separate calls held by USAID in the weeks ahead. Today's discussion and the discussions to follow on nutrition and water will focus on the technical sector impacts and responses. And so with that, in today's session, we'll focus on a high-level overview of COVID-19's impact on food security, agriculture, and resilience. Specifically, Greg and Trey and I will discuss the short and long-term implications of these impacts and the solutions needed for speedy recovery and to mitigate future harm. So with that, I'll hand it over to Greg to speak about impacts. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Maura. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. So thanks again, Maura, and hello, everybody. My name is Greg Collins. I'm a Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, and I'm also the agency's Resilience Coordinator. And as Maura mentioned, given the upcoming sessions on nutrition and water next week, I'm really going to focus my time here today on the impacts of COVID-19 on agriculture, food security, and resilience. And I think it's worth just calling out up front, in that same vein, the role that pivotal events in the past have played in this space. We'll all recall the 2007-2008 food price crisis that ultimately led to the standing up of Feed the Future, the 2011-2012 drought emergencies in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel that really gave steam to elevate our work on resilience in areas of recurrent crisis. And so I think as we begin to reflect and fully grasp the scale of the impacts of COVID-19 on agriculture, food security, and resilience, we should also be, and as we begin to mobilize a near-term response, we should also really begin paying attention to the medium and longer-term impacts in this space and the ways in which this truly extraordinary and pivotal moment may in fact fundamentally reshape our work in the years ahead. So with that, let me run through some of the impacts, the early impacts that we're seeing. As Maura mentioned, it's still early days. When We're all aware from various reporting how COVID-19 is fundamentally impacting food systems around the globe with devastating consequences for many of the countries, or potentially devastating consequences for many of the countries in which we work. And our response as the U.S. government, and rightly so, began with a focus on mitigating the spread of the virus, health outcomes, and that's where we really needed to be in the early weeks on this. But as the pandemic's moved beyond its earliest days, there's been an early and growing recognition of the potential for dire impacts on food security, agriculture, and resilience. So I think the very good news really in the last 2 to 3 weeks is that there's now a widespread recognition, even well beyond the development phase, of the potential impacts on food security. Unfortunately, the bad news, as Maura also alluded to, is that as the story continues to unfold, the estimated scale and severity of the impacts grows with it. I think most people understand this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, it's really important to note up front that the greatest impacts from COVID-19 are not from the virus itself, but rather from the measures put in place to curb its spread, so-called secondary impacts, as Maura mentioned, that are, of course, a primary concern to all of us on this call. So this includes border and port closures, export bans, and more broadly, restrictions on the movement of people and goods within and between countries, and this includes food and agricultural inputs. In turn, this has far-reaching implications for local food supply, local food prices, markets, as well as small and medium-sized enterprises, people's livelihoods, incomes, and therefore their ability to produce and purchase food. So we're really talking about a food access, a looming food access crisis. And I think that contrasts fairly significantly with 2007, 2008 and the global food price crisis. There isn't a global food supply problem necessarily. In fact, supplies are in fairly good shape at a global level. But at a local level, due to logistics constraints and others, we are seeing some deviations in local supply. And of course, the potential for disruptions from panic buying, hoarding, market speculation also exists. I also saw a report this morning from the World Bank estimating that a $110 billion downturn in remittances could occur as a result of COVID-19. And I think that underscores a couple of things that are really important here. When we talk about covariate shocks versus idiosyncratic shocks that impact individual households, we're usually talking about droughts and floods when we talk about covariate shocks, influences whole communities, even whole countries. But this is a globally covariate shock. And so when we look at that simple estimate around the downturn in remittances, we really begin to understand that some of the sources of resilience that people rely on so much, including the ability to lean on other households, lean on relatives and living overseas, are also impacted. And so whether it's a Somali living in Mogadishu who's relied on remittances from Ottawa, all of this is going to be impacted by COVID-19. And this, of course, has potentially extreme consequences for countries like Somalia and Haiti and many, many others. So it's projected now that as a result of this, there's likely to be an alarming increase in the number of people that descend into poverty and become food insecure this year. And as we all know, the consequences for households that are already poor and vulnerable and food insecure are going to be even more extreme. We note that IFPRI recently estimated that absent interventions, poverty could go up as much as 20%. And that's equivalent to over 140 million additional people. Notably, that is an exponential increase from earlier estimates that IFPRI was putting out in March through their modeling work. I think it's also notable that these estimates refer to the extreme poor, those who typically lack sufficient means to buy food. And so we can expect a commensurate increase in the number of food insecure people. And we're just beginning to see the human face of this. I'm sure, like me, many of you have seen some of the video clips coming out of places like Kenya and Nigeria. And I'm sure many of you also have seen the global report on food crises that was released on Tuesday, which provided an alarming estimate of the number of people who were at crisis levels of hunger or worse due to conflict, climate shocks, and other causes in 2019. And I think we all recognize that these numbers could increase significantly in 2020 as a result of these so-called secondary impacts of COVID-19. So again, I think some people bristle at the term secondary impacts, given how primary our concern is around these problems. And then touching briefly on regional impacts, as noted on the slide here, this is going to be impacts felt globally throughout the global food system, and food security will be impacted globally, but it should come as no surprise that sub-Saharan Africa will be disproportionately impacted. The IFPRI analysis I cited earlier estimates the potential for an increase of 23% in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And as shown on the screen here, that's equivalent to 80 million people becoming or falling into poverty, with a commensurate rise in the number of people becoming food insecure. This increase will be highest in urban areas, but rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa, where many of you work and many of our programs operate, will also be significantly impacted. So why the disproportionate impact on Africa? Mainly because of existing vulnerabilities, a shallow tipping point, conflict, climate variability, and shocks like the locust infestation in East Africa. And I think that that example of locust is actually an important one because it illustrates the multifaceted impact of COVID-19 in exacerbating existing vulnerabilities and existing shocks and stresses, in the sense that mitigation efforts, although FAO is doing a good job to get around some of these logistics constraints, but mitigation efforts have been disrupted to some degree, or at least hampered, because of the movement restrictions associated with attempting to contain the virus. And that's both enforced restrictions on the movement of people and goods, but also just people because of fear, et cetera. Not wanting to go to markets, etc. And of course, no country in the world is being spared from this. We're feeling this ourselves at home, but really it is in places like sub-Saharan Africa, like South Asia, etc., where these impacts translate into very, very concerning poverty and food security outcomes, with the potential to increase the need for humanitarian assistance as well. And as another example, the number of people estimated to be pushed into poverty in South Asia under the IFPRI modeling is about 15% in 2020, or 42 million people. And those numbers are really mind-boggling. So we continue to track what's happening in other parts of the world, Central and East Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean and Middle East, where the impact is just beginning to translate into food security impacts. And of course has the potential to destabilize already fragile economies. And again, we are beginning to get more and more data, and appreciate so much the technical expertise and leadership of some of our analytic partners in getting some numbers out there that we can begin to convene around and wrap our heads around. IFPRI, FAO, and others are doing a great job. I know FuseNet is also doing a lot of analysis as well. And I really do think it is important for us to begin to understand these impacts and really begin to invest in the analysis we need so that we can pivot programming. And as I said at the outstart, that means pivoting in the short term to mitigate the impact that's happening, but also truly understand how this is going to unfold over the medium and long term and fundamentally impact the way we approach agriculture, food security, and resilience. So now I'm going to pass the mic to Trey Hicks, who's going to talk about the implications of COVID-19 on ongoing and future humanitarian response. Over to you, Trey.
All right. Thank you, Greg, and thank you all for attending this webinar. I am Trey Hicks, the Director of USAID's Office of Food for Peace, soon to be part of the new Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, or BHA. Many of you have already heard about BHA. It's bringing together Food for Peace and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance into one bureau that will lead the U.S. government's efforts and on the international humanitarian response at USAID. In addition to all current OFTA resources and programming, BHA will encompass Food for Peace emergency food activities funded by both IDA and Title II, as well as Food for Peace's non-emergency development activities, such as our 5-year development, food security activities that many of you work on. Today, I'll talk about the near-term humanitarian challenges and emergency food response to the COVID-19 pandemic to lay the groundwork to discuss how we can continue to work across humanitarian and development-focused programming to safeguard and advance food security, also to build foundations for longer-term resilience. At Food for Peace, we work across a wide range of activities, and we agree the divide between humanitarian and development can be artificial and disconnected from the lives of people we reach. We welcome this discussion in particular as a way to further the search for effective means to leverage and bridge between humanitarian and long-term development activities. We're doing a lot in this area. We work very closely with our RFS colleagues, and it's always a great opportunity to talk about it. Working with RFS, we all need to find better ways to sequence, layer, and integrate these activities to support both humanitarian imperatives, development goals, and we also want to do this in a way that doesn't undermine or sacrifice either of these two things. This morning, or this afternoon, or whatever it is for you guys, I want to give you a snapshot of the humanitarian end of COVID-19 response. And I'm going to click the slide. Let's see. This is meant to be a technical discussion, as Mara has laid out in the beginning. I don't want to get into the operational aspects, the funding, planning, programming. All of that's going to be discussed, I think, next week at the agency level. So at today's discussion, it's going to be at the high-level technical discussion, just as a reminder. But Greg just talked about the major challenges and risks we are seeing related to COVID-19. He rightly pointed out that there's a very high risk of longer-term impacts, which we are considering early and carefully as part of our response. And you all know the risks are significant, and some are already realities. Others are not yet. And you can see on the slide there the latest from the FuseNet Global Forecast, just to give some context. This FuseNet system, it's closely monitoring the potential food security impacts of COVID-19, including on global food markets and supply chains, and on the levels of food insecurity in many countries. So it's important to point out that before the pandemic, FuseNet was projecting that 90 million people in 46 countries would need humanitarian food assistance in 2020. Even this pre-COVID-19 scenario stretches our ability as well as other donors' abilities to respond as humanitarians. This was pre-COVID. So COVID's just going to make it even worse, and an even higher challenge. In fiscal year 19, Food for Peace reached 76 million people in 55 countries with food assistance, including almost 2.6 million metric tons of food, as well as market-based food assistance and a whole range of activities around that, including support for safety nets, resilience building activities, and as well as full-on development programs for the most vulnerable. The predictions for 2020 are now shifting significantly to account for actual and anticipated increases in food insecurity and increased requirements for emergency food assistance due to the impacts of COVID-19. And as we had, Greg already alluded to, there's widespread losses of income, livelihoods, remittances. There's a lack of adequate social safety nets. These are all expected to contribute to the increased food insecurity and malnutrition, particularly among the poor. Areas where we already work and new areas are being affected. So this is a massive impact on where we are working and where we could be working in the future. Both rural and urban areas are being affected. Refugees, displaced people, all these are at particular risk. On the positive side, international grain prices, as many of you have been tracking, are relatively stable so far, and most borders remain open to trade so far. FuseNet will continue to monitor and update this outlook. The pandemic will put many already vulnerable individuals at increased risk and create food insecurity in new populations, suffering a range of COVID-19 related impacts. Our humanitarian mission is to save lives, to ease suffering for those in the greatest need. The COVID-19 crisis is challenging all of our partners and stressing our existing programs to meet that mission. And let me see if I can click to the other slide. There we go. We are working closely with our partners to pivot and adapt as swiftly as possible to address these immediate needs. Technically, we are considering our approaches and how we ensure we do no harm while meeting critical short-term needs and considering a pathway forward towards recovery and building longer-term development opportunities. So, for example, as you see on the slide, in South Sudan, where more than half the population already needs assistance, humanitarian partners are adapting health, food, nutrition, and water sanitation programs and hygiene programs to address the COVID-19 threat. As these photos show, for example, food assistance distribution protocols are being changed, schedules are being reworked to prevent crowding, and the staff at the sites are teaching proper hand washing and social distancing. So we have already for weeks been pivoting our existing programs to adapt to the new challenges. The situation requires working across all the sectors from water, sanitation, emergency health to food, nutrition, and other interventions. And it requires being able to leverage the strong development and humanitarian experiences in places like Ethiopia to allow USAID and our partners to pivot and adapt to serve those in need most efficiently. This requires balancing and perhaps prioritizing activities to address multiple risks in sequence, from the immediate risk of COVID-19 contagion to secondary risks like disruptions to food systems leading to increased hunger, and even unrelated risks like the locust outbreak in East Africa, which is just the cherry on the top when it comes to some of these regions that are hard hit. COVID-19 is a unique and extreme situation, as we all know. It is overlapping all these challenges. It requires us to set clear priorities and make difficult decisions as we try to slow increasing human suffering and humanitarian needs. The response is also an opportunity to think really concretely how we currently coordinate and how we can better prepare for the next global scale pandemic crisis, because COVID-19 will not likely be our last, unfortunately. BHA certainly doesn't have all the answers on how to balance, how to prioritize, integrate our responses. That's why we're here talking to all of you. I'm very interested to learn about your experiences, your ideas. I want to hear the questions from you all. I want to hear what our partners are doing on the ground to confront this. It's important that we get everyone at the table so we can tackle this together. So big thanks for your partnership. Thank you so much for the work you do. All your staff that's on the front lines, they're heroes, and I just want to say we appreciate you. Over.
Thanks, Trey. So hi, everyone. It's Maura back speaking again. In the next section of our presentation, I want to talk about some of our responses to the pandemic. Our top priority, as I mentioned earlier, is to save lives. People need nutritious food to eat, they need income to purchase that food, and they need safe markets and options to access food. So with that framing in mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about our response priorities and how we should be, looking ahead to the medium, long-term impact of the pandemic. First of all, I'd like to talk about trade and policy actions. We will look to help governments get their policies right and to help build the data and analysis they need to make sound decisions that protect people while mitigating secondary impacts. This would include keeping the trade of food and agriculture products and inputs and other essential goods like sanitary and hygiene products. Keep them flowing within and across borders, including by expediting customs clearances and establishing green channels. Green channels referring to the designation of food workers and businesses as essential and exempting these workers and products from movement restrictions. It also may include facilitative regulations such as relaxing restrictions on trucking hours. In addition, in Africa, it's going to be particularly important to keep an eye on policies that impede trade of agricultural products into and among African countries. An important consideration may be encouraging governments to review and potentially relax some of these policies while maintaining food safety standards. And also, export bans on food commodities should definitely be discouraged because these tend to exacerbate regional food supply and price shocks, as we saw in the 2007-2008 food price crises. Our ongoing Feed the Future efforts can also strengthen resilience and reduce the disruption to the food system. For example, a policy or a market system approach that promotes cross-border trade and the marketing of safe, nutritious foods while controlling the spread of COVID-19 can help to maintain the flow of food from farm to market. It will also be important in our support to support the sustainability of local production to ensure food is available and the supply is there and it keeps the prices down, especially since sustained production can ensure staple supply to meet the demand for both staples and fresh foods at affordable prices. At the same time, it's imperative to evaluate food and agriculture aggregation centers and transport networks for safety and to keep them from being a source of the viral spread. Equally important is keeping markets and small and medium enterprises and jobs going. This is to mitigate impact and speed up recovery. Support is needed to prioritize strengthening and, where necessary, reestablishment of markets for critical value chains working from farm to market to table. We're planning to continue the Feed the Future work to build markets that can adapt to shifting preferences and dynamic challenges like this to provide and meet demand for safe and nutritious food. We'll aim to emphasize producer, transport, and processor connections to resurgent market and demand in cities and towns. This work could include helping farmers and businesses identify and tap into new markets. And on the topic of private sector engagement, USAID continues to engage strategic private sector partners to understand their immediate response to COVID-19 and the important role in economic recovery. We recognize it is critical for us to work as closely as ever with all of you in the private sector to mitigate economic losses that are already being felt and to ensure the free flow of supply chains that are essential to food security. Of course, we've already been in communication with a number of companies about their response to the pandemic and to discuss how we can coordinate and collaborate going forward to jointly support farmers and small and medium enterprises in rural communities. And then also, we're focused on increasing access to finance for small and medium-sized businesses and others. A linchpin, but already this is really deeply constrained. So to do this, we're going to look to leverage existing programs and relationships to unlock finance, particularly for these smaller businesses in agriculture, from producers to processors to traders, right across the food system. And as part of this effort, we also need to increase access to financial services for food system actors with an emphasis especially on women participants. So in all of this work, I'm just going to close out the presentation here. I want to welcome the opportunity to deepen our engagement with all of you way beyond this short webinar that we're having today. And with that, we can move to Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maura. Hi, everyone. It's Jen Cupp again. I'll be the facilitator for our question and answer time today. We'll get started with some of the questions you all submitted when you registered, and then we'll switch over to some of the questions that you guys are submitting as we speak in the chat box. So please do continue to share questions, comments in the chat box during this time. But we'll go ahead and switch over to our first question that came in ahead of time. And this one is, how can the COVID-19 response ensure that we are also strengthening resilience to other shocks in fragile contexts, and how can we help vulnerable people, communities, and systems build resilience to this pandemic while they're building resilience to other shocks and stressors? And we did get a couple of questions. I think a great example of this that we'd love to have the presenter speak to is the desert locust outbreak in East Africa is an example of a dual shock. So with that, I think Greg and Trey, if you guys want to weigh in on this one.
Sure, maybe I can start and then pass to Trey. And apologies for not being on video for my first segment. I forgot that last click. And here I was making wonderful hand gestures and everything the whole time. But I think a great question. And I think one of the real lessons, well, first I'll start with this. We've been, as you well know, working hard across the humanitarian development sphere, across sectors, on these collective efforts to build resilience, particularly in areas of recurrent crisis. And I think we can expect that those investments are going to pay off in this instance in terms of people faring better than they would have absent those investments. But this really does point out a couple of things that are super important. One is what I said earlier, the global breadth of this shock really is undermining some of the sources of resilience that people count on so much, whether it's counting on a relative in the capital city, overseas, et cetera. And the vast networks of people that lean on each other in times of need, these social network capitals, are, when the whole network's impacted, it makes it extremely difficult for people to provide the support that people have depended on in the past. So I think it is one of these remarkably covariant, as I said earlier, shocks, and we haven't truly witnessed something like that before, somewhat in 2007, 2008, but not anywhere at this scale. And I think it also points out the importance of health and health system strengthening as a part of the formula for building resilience, part of the collective work needed to work across sectors. And even before this event, I've been greatly heartened by our colleagues in global health and the extent to which they've come to the table, both as the member of the agency's Resilience Leadership Council, but in really bringing forward resilience in their work, resilience measurement. And so I think one of the benefits, if we can look for benefits on the back end of this, is an expectation that global health and us will even more together to figure out how we bring together the food security work, the agriculture work, the health work, the work on nutrition and water security, sanitation, and hygiene that already bring us together, and other leadership councils in the agency. So I think that's one of the very good things that could come out of this. I also would say, and people who've heard me talk about resilience have heard me talk about this before, even in places like northern Kenya, where we experienced cyclical droughts. If you ask households in northern Kenya what's the biggest threat to their well-being, the answer is somebody getting sick. And so all of this points out how important it is to begin to bring health to the fore in the resilience work for the agency. In terms of how we can ensure that the response to both the near-term and longer-term response to the secondary impacts of COVID-19 helps strengthen resilience, I think just what Maura was pointing out, we need to work through existing markets, support existing small and medium-sized enterprise to be part of the response, to make sure those food systems are actually able to function and provide the food that people are going to desperately need in these challenging times, rather than work around markets and systems that we've been investing in to develop. So I think there is a fundamental role for rural areas to play in supporting the resilience even in urban areas, and making sure that in the urgency of the moment that we're pausing for that half second to make sure we're working through existing systems, building existing institutions and their ability to respond is going to be really important. And I also think this really points out the importance of a body of work that's been growing over the last few years in terms of shock responsive social safety nets. And we've seen various globally safety nets expand in the face of COVID-19. And I think that going forward that there's going to be an increased interest in the ability to have in place shock responsive safety nets, things like shock responsive health systems, et cetera. And so I'll leave it there and pass to Trey to add on. Thanks.
I don't have tons to add, but I would say I wholeheartedly align with what Greg just said. But in the humanitarian context, you know, we have a lot of programs that are already targeting the most vulnerable. And for example, the safety net programs that are in Ethiopia, they're perfect for flexing into new challenges. So if there is shocks that come, for example, from the COVID or if it's locust, we have programs already in place that we can very easily flex to take on those new shocks to help those communities to weather whatever that shock is. We're going to be doing it with whatever comes out of the locust issue in Ethiopia and all across that region. If you look at the Sahel as well, we can flex there. But we also have the ability to use what we call complementary activities. So as you saw on the slide that I was showing during my presentation, we're already starting to work into even our feeding programs, wash training and social distancing and other things and other activities that we can fund even in a food program through our complementary activities kind of budget line. So we are looking at everything, every tool that we have, putting it on the table and trying to figure out for each context, how we are going to help first respond to the humanitarian imperative, but second, we need to do it in a way that will help build resilience to this particular COVID-related, health-related shock, but all the other shocks that are out there. So we have the tools, we just have to have the proper visibility of what's happening on the ground and being able to respond quickly enough to get those activities well placed. So, over.
Great, thank you. Let's go to the next question, which is how are USAID and partners measuring impacts on agriculture, food security, and resilience during periods of lockdown, et cetera, when data cannot be collected in person? And how do we know who is being most severely impacted and who should be targeted for assistance? And I'll add to this a question that came in over the chat box, which is if there are partners who are working on similar data or tracking of overall numbers of how COVID is impacting communities, how should they get in touch to coordinate with USAID?
So maybe I could start again. I mean, I think this is one of the big challenges when we get beyond the immediate, this shock is happening, how do we get operational? It's how do we monitor and assess what's happening around the world? And I think we're already working with our missions, and I provided guidance to our missions on how to try to adapt and be flexible for monitoring and assessment using innovative tools such as using cell phones for data collection. We've already shifted some work with the World Bank. We had some investments in their Living Standards Measurement Survey. The in-person survey is not going to be possible, but we're shifting to higher frequency phone surveys to really be able to capture the impacts of COVID-19 in terms of how hard people are hit, in terms of their food security and well-being, and how quickly they recover. It's not dissimilar from approaches to resilience measurement we've used in the past through our recurrent monitoring systems, where we trigger data collection at the moment of a shock and track over time how hard people are hit, how quickly they recover, and then really in the aftermath of all this try to understand why some households were able to recover more quickly than other households. We're also engaged in conversations with IFRI, FAO, and others to really look at priority modeling and how we use new data coming in almost every day to update our models to try and understand the impacts not only at a global scale, but at a country scale and even subnational scale. And so I think this is one of the fundamental priorities for us. As raised in the question chat box, it's absolutely critical that we come together as donors, as partners, and have one coordinated effort around these analysis. One of the most dangerous things in a moment like this is to have a series of conflicting analysis, and we're just getting beyond that initial moment where there's a whole bunch of information being churned out. One of the things we've heard from our folks in missions is you've got to curate this information. So people are on information overload. Sometimes the information is conflicting with one another. Some estimates are outrageously high and not supported by the data that we do have. So I think it's absolutely a priority for us, and we're putting money behind convening donors, convening key analytic partners to really agree on what are the priority analytics, what investments need to be made now to make sure we're collecting the data we need to know how things are rolling out in the future. on a more practical monitoring of USAID projects, we're also looking at innovative tools there, from Earth observation to, again, using phone data. These are all imperfect and they don't substitute. There are bias problems, et cetera. But we are committed to being as innovative as possible to respond in this moment. Thanks. Trey, did you want to respond to Maura?
So if people are asking me like how we are going to coordinate, I would say, is that correct? Is that what we're asking, how to coordinate with us? Is that part of it? Okay. So if you're seeking, how do you coordinate with our efforts? On the non-humanitarian side, and forgive me if you covered this, Greg, because I had a problem with my headphone. On the non-humanitarian side, it's the task force that's head by Dr. Staley, at the head of the agency. If we're talking about coordination with humanitarian efforts, we set up a response management team, and so if you have worked with us on humanitarian programs in the past, it's the same structure that you are familiar with all of our kind of DART RMT model that we set up. We have a deputy manager for coordination that works with NGOs. We also have a deputy manager for planning, which does all of our programming. So it depends on if you're humanitarian wanting coordination, or if you want the development, non-humanitarian, kind of broader USAID work. But those would be your 2 points of contact. And hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Trey and Greg. We'll move on to the next question, which is, I'm actually going to take one from the chat box. As Maura mentioned, we're responding on the home front here in the U.S. as well as abroad at the same time to COVID-19. And this question is, as the government distributes emergency assistance in the U.S., is there any expectation of cuts to international assistance? And do you think you have the flexibility of resources needed to effectively respond overseas? So this is a question maybe Maura and Trey, you guys could both weigh in on this one.
Go ahead, Trey. I'll let you start off.
So are we anticipating cuts to assistance? Is that what the question was?
Yes, and do you have the flexibility needed to respond?
So, I mean, we definitely don't expect any cuts. I've been working on foreign assistance for many, many years, and I haven't really seen any actual cuts to budgeting. If anything, we're getting a lot of supplemental funding. So when it comes to resources, Congress is providing us very robust sources of funding. So I'm not sure where the concern is over cuts. We have pretty steady flow of funding coming from Congress.
Great, thanks. I'll move on to another question. Does RFS intend to change Feed the Future country plans or CDCSs as a result of COVID-19?
I'll say a few words, Greg, and then you can chime in. I mean, the objectives of the Global Food Security Strategy remain the same, which is reducing poverty, malnutrition, and hunger. We'll continue along those lines. Of course, you know, we want to flex and adapt to make sure that we're addressing the reality on the ground because things are changing. So I know that missions are looking at to make sure that their strategies align with meeting the most urgent needs that are related to this. But in principle, there's no changes to the strategy. It's just, I think our approach is something that we'll need to be seeing whether or not we need to flex and adapt. Greg, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, these strategies are flexible. They're meant to be flexible, and I certainly expect that, although as Maura says, the core objectives of agricultural-led growth, resilience, and nutrition remain the same. There may be some needs to pivot, including pivoting geographically. We've already gotten some missions reaching out to us about the ability to pivot outside the current zone, and you know, there's a real challenge there, and so they do have the flexibility to respond to changing situation. If that means doing it is literally just a change memo to the country plan. It's not a big lift. It's not a 18-month process as was the the original writing of the plans themselves. So they have that flexibility. I think beyond that sort of technicality, one of the big challenges here is the pandemic itself is hitting urban areas hard. Now, it's going to begin to leak out into rural areas, particularly in Africa where we're working. And those communities are already so vulnerable that we can't pick up stakes where we are and run to where the pandemic is hitting hardest. We really need to focus our efforts on where we believe the food security impacts are going to be most significant. Yet at the same time, the areas we're working in, the rural areas, have a role to play even in bolstering the resilience of urban areas. And so where we want to be flexible, I don't think this means a wholesale lifting up stakes of where we are and moving somewhere else. There continues to be questions about the ability to flex where we are, and we continue to make the case that, you know, we could reach more areas with additional resources, but it doesn't make sense to leave some of those vulnerable areas, the areas in which we work, given some of the food security impacts could be quite severe in those areas. So, yeah, I think that flexibility and strategy is there. Whether you see this immediately reflected in updated GFSS country plans and CDCS, I think that may be back burner to the immediate response. But we are being encouraged, including by Acting Administrator Barsa, to be thinking not 3-6 months out, but 18 months out, 2 years out, 3 years, 5 years out, about the long-term impact. The sort of where I started my part of the discussion is that, yes, we need to mount an immediate response, but we need to get ahead of the longer-term impact, because I do believe there is going to be a fundamental long-term impact of this event.
Thanks, Greg and Maura. I think this goes back to a question I saw in the chat as well, and Trey, you may want to weigh in on this one as well, about whether we have the flexibility, does USAID have the flexibility that it needs to be responding rapidly to COVID-19 overseas?
I would say, you know, from my perspective, it depends on which funding account we're talking about. If you're talking about IDA, IDA is one of the most flexible accounts that is in government. So, and thank you very much to Congress for giving us that flexibility. Title II is a little bit different because there's so many requirements that we have to fulfill before we can use the money. So on the Title II side, there's requirements such as cargo preference, sourcing from the U.S., you know, not exceeding a certain percentage on overland costs and other types of warehousing costs. That's where we're going to have a lot of challenges, because COVID just increases all of those overhead costs, especially as we have issues with ports closing down and borders closing down and some of these supply chains getting disrupted. It doesn't give us the flexibility to meet those new challenges. So that's where I think is probably the most acute need for flexibility, and that's where probably I'm the most worried, is that side of the account.
Thanks for weighing in on that, Trey. The next question is, with the global food supply looking okay for the moment, in Africa, how concerned are you about farmers being able to plant on time and access and afford inputs? Is there a role for USAID to partner with agribusinesses to protect rural livelihoods? And Maura, maybe you could respond to this one.
I mean, absolutely. That is work that we are already doing under Feed the Future, working with markets to strengthen access to markets, working with smallholder farmers and across the whole food system, as I said in my remarks, from farm to market to table. So reading your question to make sure I'm answering it, but in terms of finance, also, USAID has been working on access to finance for SMEs and agribusiness. And so we're looking at how we can work with our existing partners where we have things set up and see how we can adapt to this situation.
Maybe just to add on a little bit there, I mean, the concern is very real about the ability to plant the next season, and that's why one of the priority areas of intervention is on trade and policy and making sure that although the priority is health and safety, that we need to ensure that goods like agricultural inputs are continuing to flow across borders and within countries so that farmers are able to plant, so that we don't have one of these situations where we have this compound downstream effect that extends longer than it needs to. So a lot of the actions that we take now and a lot of the influence we're able to have with partner country governments through our missions and our embassies are going to be critically important because it's the actions taken now that are going to mitigate the potential for a cascading downward compound effect here of each of these impacts spurring another impact. And I think that's what the person who wrote the question was referring to. On the finance question, it is a really, really significant problem and one that probably resonates with a lot of Americans, frankly. The need to keep liquidity and finance small, medium-sized enterprises functioning because so many jobs, employment, et cetera, depend on it. It's critical, and yet this was a problem before COVID-19, and so trying to figure that out, trying to work with partners within the U.S. government, beyond the U.S. government. We don't have all the solutions, but we know this is a priority challenge that we need to wrap our heads around and bring our private sector partners into the discussion about how we solve these really, really, really challenging problems.
Thanks, Greg and Maura. The next question is, USAID has responded to other crises and pandemics before. What lessons learned do you find most applicable to this one, and what are the unique challenges that you see in our response to this pandemic as opposed to others? I think this is a question for all of you to respond to.
Go ahead, Greg.
I mean, I would just, okay, go ahead, you can go, Greg.
No, go ahead, Trey.
Should I go? No, I was just going to state the obvious. I mean, this particular challenge is something that is hitting home much more than probably any other humanitarian crisis I've ever heard of, where the things that we're trying to help overseas is actually something that we're also trying to help our neighbor next door or our family, you know. So the biggest challenge is that this is hitting us at home as well as hitting every single aspect of our work overseas, whether it's humanitarian or development. So that's number one. And then the unique challenges is just, you know, how do you prioritize the different types of responses? And so, you know, the humanitarian, we always focus on the most critical, life-saving, but then you have other areas that aren't traditional humanitarian that are also critical, life-saving. And so there's kind of like a blurring of urgencies and a blurring of priorities, and it just makes it hard to, you can't just approach it the same way we've always approached it, because all those walls and divisions between domestic and international and humanitarian and non-humanitarian and life-saving and non-life-saving, all those walls are going down. And it's not so easy to have black and white divisions between all these things. I think that's the biggest challenge from my perspective. Over.
I would just add to that. I mean, clearly there's a parallel when we look at what happened with Ebola in West Africa. And I think on the agriculture, food security, resilience side, we've certainly learned some lessons about intervening market systems interventions that we are already bringing to bear in the guidance that we're sharing out with our missions on how to respond. But totally recognize that this is an extraordinary event. It is not like Ebola because the scale is so dramatically larger. Similarly, 2007, 2008 was a food crisis of a very different cause. And I think it's important to recognize that because there's been some conflation in the press that there's a global food supply crisis, and that's not the case. But we still learned lessons from what happened back then, particularly around export bans and trade that exacerbated the problem. And I think There's been some really good webinars and discussions by Maximo at FAO, some of the stuff IFPRI is doing, really making a strong policy case that we don't need to create a food price crisis here on top of the crisis that's already happening. And so getting those policies right, influencing partner governments to keep trade flowing in a responsible and safe way is going to be critical. And so I think this is about aggregating lessons from crises of the past, and also about charting into or going into uncharted territory. And I think a lot of the questions that I'm seeing pop in the chat box are questions we have. We know finance is needed for small, medium-sized enterprise. It's not there. What are we going to do? I mean, as Trey said, it's reflecting some of the challenges at home. So our real desire to connect with you all today is not to lay out a set of answers. It's to rally around a set of questions. I think really we put the analytics out in the fore because I think that's something we need to agree on what the impacts are going to be so that we can act in unison. And this really, if there ever was a collective action problem, this is surely it. Over.
And just to add, one small thing to what Trey and Greg were already saying, especially, in West Africa during the Ebola, we saw that even in the weak markets, like in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, that the ag and food, small and medium enterprises, they were still there and they were still key in that recovery, that how important that is. So I think we really, recognize the important role that small and medium enterprises will play in any recovery. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pop back over to a question that we received ahead of the session, and it's what are some promising models that can be scaled to address COVID-19, especially using technology? Maura, maybe this can be one you answer.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a really good question, right? Because, in the situation that we're in, when we, the social distancing and our ability to, have physical activity, it really creates a huge challenge, but there's also an opportunity there, like what we're doing today. And I'm sure everybody here in the audience has been on every single, video platform out there. We're all learning new technologies. But in this case, in terms of using this opportunity to really innovate on virtual communication is really important to ensure essential food systems continue to function, right, despite all of these shocks. So I think integrated digital technology is certainly one example that is an underutilized tool that allows actors to rapidly create and disseminate, and adapt tailored messages. One example that we have is working with Scientific Animations Without Borders. We worked with them during the fall armyworm crisis. They're an online university-based program, and they place expert knowledge in an animated format to translate it into an infinite number of local languages and distribute content worldwide. So and they use, online networks such as WhatsApp. During the fall armyworm that emerged in 2016 and destroyed so many crops across Africa and Asia, this group, their acronym is SABO, Scientific Animations Without Borders, were able to work with Feed the Future's fall armyworm partners to develop an animation in more than 40 local languages. And that really quickly helped farmers across these regions to be able to identify the new pest and also to seek, local extension advice. And so as the pest is continuing to spread, the clip is continuing to reach new audiences. And so this is really an innovation that we think we can scale and use during COVID-19 as well. I think some other areas that we can consider include mobile money and digital banking services, as well as mobile data collection and information dissemination. And as we see the COVID-19 increasing society's dependence on information technology, in many countries, we know that men have more consistent access to information and technology than women. So closing that gender-digital divide is really more urgent now than ever. We know that when women can have access to information safely, they'll be able to better protect themselves and their families. So thank you.
Great point. Thanks, Maura. Another question is, what considerations do we need to make when planning response options to ensure smallholder farming is deemed an essential service, critical to domestic food supplies, that really deserves attention and government support? Greg, maybe this can be one for you.
Yeah, I think it's really a critical question because there's a lot of unevenness between countries in terms of whether they're considering agriculture an essential service and allowing related activities to take place. And so again, it's this really difficult thing to balance that, as Trey mentioned, we're facing on the home front as well, is what is an essential business. Now, we, of course, believe that agriculture and smallholder farmers, and in fact actors throughout the agri-food system, are critically essential to preventing the situation from getting worse. So we are working with our missions and encouraging them and providing guidance to them on how to engage with partner country governments to really make the case for agriculture as an essential service. And really, as I was mentioning earlier, not in the situation where all of the preventative actions, many of them necessary, create this cascading effect of outcomes that increase the problem 6, 12, 18 months from now. So it's got to be done on a country-by-country basis. There is no global solution. Partner country governments are struggling with these questions themselves. And I think, in some instances, we're even having challenges connecting with partner country governments on these issues because they're dealing with so many issues on their own. So it is a role, we believe, a critical role that we as the U.S. government can play, and there's definitely a interagency discussion ongoing around this. How do we get these key messages on trade and things like green channels that Maura was talking about into the fore of the discussion? I do think what I said earlier in terms of the pivot from an initial focus just on preventing virus spread to this growing recognition around the potential for massive and severe food security outcomes is really going to open up that opportunity to engage with governments in a more direct basis about what mitigation measures can we take now to prevent that potential from happening. Because right now we're modeling out and seeing what the potential are under different scenarios. If you haven't seen the various scenario work that IFPRI has put out, I encourage you to look at it because there are very different scenarios depending on what happens with trade and whether export bans are put in place. And so I think we can actually use those models to say, hey, these are the policy interventions we need to make and prioritize. These are the conversations we need to have with our partner country governments. These are the issues we need to come together as a donor community with other donors and partners and agree upon so we are a united voice speaking to these issues in each country as it grapples the very difficult challenge of striking the right balance between preventing the spread of this virus and mitigating the secondary impacts.
Thanks, Greg. This may be another question for you too, but we got one from the chat box that says, you talked about conflict being a major exacerbating factor, and we're already seeing greater unrest and blame narratives circulating in already fragile conflict-affected countries. Can you share your current thinking on how the response strategy will address the potential for increased conflict and promote social cohesion?
I'm not sure who that's for, but maybe I could start and then pass to Trey. I mean, I think, as many of you know, part of USAID's transformation and reorganization brings together the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, or soon to be Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, and also the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. And it is, we're doing that because there's a recognition that this is all causally intertwined. And that is really true when we look at what's happening in terms of food security impacts, exacerbating fragility and grievances. I think we're all aware, going back in history, of the role that food riots and hunger have played in fragility in the past. So it's very much on our minds. Within the context of USAID and our planning and our prioritizing, these issues around governance, around conflict mitigation, are at the fore. In fact, I would even say up until recently that discussion has preceded even the discussion on food security. So there was a very early recognition that these issues are critical, that there is a very real possibility that this could not only exacerbate existing conflicts and problems on this front, but even create new ones. And I think we're seeing that around the globe and some of the tensions that are being seen in places like Kibera and other places. So it is a very, very serious concern. The agency is taking it incredibly seriously, and it is part of our broader USAID interagency thinking on how we're going to collectively respond to this. So again, we don't have all the solutions, but I would assure you that in every conversation we're having about this, these governance questions, these issues around conflict mitigation loom large. And there's a very real recognition that when these secondary impacts hit areas that are already fragile and conflict affected, that there's a real potential to really have things bubble over. Trey, do you want to add to that?
No, I mean, you hit the nail. It's through this kind of the R3, we call it the R3 structure, the three bureaus. But I will tell you that I don't know so much on the strategy side, which strategy you're talking about, but when it comes to actual internal planning, the folks that are directly involved in conflict mitigation and conflict issues play a central role in how the agency is trying to plan for the next, 10 steps out. So those activities are happening. The conflict mitigation and prevention folks are in the center of that, very well integrated in how the agency is trying to not only deal with today's problems, but also think about what's going to happen tomorrow and plan for that as well. And the conflict issue is right in the middle of that. So it's a good question, and I can assure you that the right people are involved. Over.
Great, thanks Trey and Greg. So I just want to draw everyone's attention to the change in layout that you probably see in front of you with the webinar. We have a couple of questions we want to make sure we're posing to all of you now that you've asked questions of us that we would love to get your feedback and hear your thoughts on as an audience. So please do take a look at those, and you can type in your answers and submit them to us. And with that, I think we've come to the end of our time for Q&A. So again, thanks to everyone who submitted questions beforehand in the chat box. We really appreciate you all taking part in this. Even though we weren't able to get to all, every single one of the questions today, everything else submitted will help us shape future communication and resources. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Maura to provide some parting words before we close out the session.
Thanks, Jen. And please, everyone, do contribute, as Jen asked. We really do want to hear from you, and we hope that you'll remember that we're having sessions next week on nutrition and water, the 29th and the 30th. So really, first of all, I just want to thank you for all of the questions that you did provide today and for a great discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, this session serves as just really, it's an initial conversation. Every day, all of us, right, are learning so much more about the fallouts of this pandemic. And really appreciate a lot of the amazing work that some of you are doing to keep up with the analytics. We're working closely with many of you to try and keep our finger on that pulse, and we welcome the opportunity that we stay connected throughout the next few months on what we're learning on all of our ends, and how we can come together to assess and to mitigate and speed recovery in the face of this unfolding crisis. So thank you again for joining this webinar today, and please do take time to fill out this section right now, and we look forward to seeing you again next week for the nutrition and water session. Thanks, and bye.
Thanks, Maura. So for everyone who joined, we're going to keep this open until 4:30 so everyone can continue to provide their feedback on the questions that we have. And I would also like to draw your attention to the Files pod, where you can download a copy of the presentation. And we also have, hot off the presses, some new guidance on safe and functioning markets during COVID-19 that folks are welcome to download and use. And with that, we will go ahead and close out the audio. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.